welcome back to Whispers in the Dark. Tonight's story begins the way many old fairy tales do, with a lonely house, a loving father, and a wish made into the dark. But this is not the story you were told as a child. This is not a story about innocence rewarded, or lies forgiven, or a wooden puppet becoming a real boy because he learned to be good. This is a story about flesh. This is a story about what happens when a carved thing is forced to become living meat. Not all at once, not mercifully, but slowly, painfully, while every lie twists bone and tendon inside a body that was never meant to hold either. So dim the lights, settle in, and listen closely, because Geppetto did make a boy, and the blue fairy did make him real, but neither of them understood what that would truly mean. In a narrow village of stone lanes and leaning chimneys, where the mornings smelled of soot, bread, and wet timber, there lived an old woodcarver named Geppetto. His cottage sat at the edge of the village, where the road narrowed into a path, and the path vanished into black pines. In daylight, the house looked harmless, almost tender in its age. The roof sagged in the middle. The shutters hung crooked. Ivy pressed through the cracks in the mortar, and small yellow flowers grew in the moss around the doorstep. At night, it became something else. The windows looked like dark eyes. The chimney coughed smoke in weak bursts. The pine trees stood around it like silent priests at a grave. Inside, the cottage was warm and cluttered. Shelves bowed under jars of nails, bundles of wire, scraps of fabric, and half-carved birds with blank eyes. Blocks of cedar and pine leaned in corners like pale coffins. Thin curls of wood shavings covered the floor. The air always carried the smell of sap, varnish, lamp oil, and old wool. Geppetto lived alone with a red cricket cage by the window, a workbench polished smooth by years of labor, and the quiet ache of a man who had outlived the shape of his own happiness. He had once had a wife, if the village whispers were true, and perhaps a child too. No one asked. Age had folded him inward, his back bent like a bow. His hands, though knotted and shaking at rest, became precise and gentle when they touched wood. When he carved, he seemed less like a lonely old man, and more like someone listening to a voice only he could hear. On an autumn evening, as wind rubbed the pine branches together and made them sigh, Geppetto found a block of pale wood behind his shed. He did not remember buying it. It was smooth and strangely warm despite the cold. When he set it on the bench, his lamp flame bent toward it as if drawn by breath. He laid his palm on the grain and felt a faint trembling under the surface. He should have burned it. Instead, he smiled. His tools began their work. The knife trimmed away rough corners. The gouge dug out soft curves. The rasp shaped cheeks, brow, and chin. Shavings fell around his feet in pale spirals. The face emerged first. A sharp little nose, a pointed chin, a mouth that seemed nearly ready to curl into a grin. Then the long limbs, the narrow hands, the carved shoes, the small ribbed chest. When he lifted the figure into the lamplight, the puppet seemed so full of expectancy that Geppetto laughed aloud. "There," he whispered, "a son." He dressed the puppet in a little shirt and short trousers sewn from old cloth. He painted black shoes on its feet and gave it a cap with a feather. He sat it in a chair beside the hearth and spoke to it while supper simmered. He told it about the village market, about the church bells, about the stars beyond the pines, about loneliness and winter, and all the things a father tells a child before the child is old enough to understand. The cricket in the cage rubbed its legs softly and watched. Late that night, Geppetto knelt beside the bed and prayed. He prayed for health, for mercy, for one more kindness before death found him. Then, with shame burning in his throat, he prayed for the impossible. He prayed that the puppet might live, not as a trick, not as a dream, but truly, that it might speak, that it might laugh, that it might call him father. When the cottage had gone silent, and even the fire had collapsed into a bed of red eyes, a light entered the room. It slipped through the shutters without opening them. It gathered over the puppet in blue and silver radiance, cool as moonlight on snow. The air filled with the scent of rain and lilies. Geppetto stirred in his sleep, but did not wake. From within the light stepped a woman shaped from brightness itself. Her hair flowed as though beneath clear water. Her face was beautiful in the way winter dawn is beautiful, soft and impossible, and far away from human life. This was the Blue Fairy, though no hymn in the village church would have named her kindly if men had known what she truly was. She touched the puppet's brow with one pale finger. "Little thing," she murmured, "you are wished for. Let us see if wishing can bear the weight of flesh." Her finger left a blue mark upon the wood, just between the eyes. The mark sank in like dye into thirsty cloth. The puppet's body shuddered once, then again. A cracking sound ran through it from head to heel, not like dry wood breaking, but like knuckles being forced apart. The puppet's painted eyes rolled. Its chest jerked inward, as if trying to inhale. The first breath came with a wet, choking noise. By dawn, Geppetto awoke to laughter. Pinocchio was dancing barefoot across the floor, his limbs jerking with stiff excitement, arms thrown wide, knocking over spoons and nearly toppling the cricket cage. He looked the same as before in the dim gold of morning. Painted cheeks, wooden fingers, bright staring eyes. Yet something had changed. He moved with purpose now. He grinned and called Geppetto father in a clear, eager voice that made the old man weep. For several days, joy covered everything. Geppetto bought school books he could hardly afford. He made Pinocchio a lunch wrapped in cloth. He spoke to him about honesty, obedience, and kindness. The cricket, whom Pinocchio called Jiminy, was freed from his cage and appointed conscience, which pleased Geppetto greatly and pleased Pinocchio not at all. Jiminy was old for a cricket and wise in the tiresome way of those who have survived by paying attention. He lived above the mantel and watched the puppet with bright eyes. At first, there were only small oddities. Pinocchio's would no longer sounded the same when Geppetto tapped it. certain parts of him had gone dull, less hollow. His wrists felt warmer. The grain on his neck had begun to blur beneath the paint. Then the lies began. The first was harmless. Geppetto asked if Pinocchio had eaten the pear meant for supper. Crumbs still clung to the corner of his mouth, but Pinocchio smiled and said no. His nose gave a faint creak. He clapped both hands to his face. Geppetto laughed, thinking it a simple magic. The nose had lengthened by the width of a thumb. Jiminy called from the mantel that lies have consequences. Geppetto said the lesson was useful. Pinocchio, embarrassed and angry, sat by the hearth until the nose slowly shrank again. Yet when it did, something else happened. A thin strip of varnished wood peeled from the underside of his nose, like dead skin. Beneath it glistened a line of red. Pinocchio touched it and hissed. "What is it?" Geppetto asked. "Nothing," Pinocchio replied too quickly. That evening, after the old man slept, Pinocchio stood before the black window and picked at the peeling place with one small fingernail. The wood there had gone soft. When he pressed harder, the tip split. Not split like timber, split like a lip. Dark blood, thicker than syrup, welled out and rolled down over his painted smile. He stared at it in delight and terror. The next morning, the wound had sealed into a pale seam that did not look carved at all. Time moved strangely after that. Some changes came in hours, others in hidden increments so slight that only those who watched closely noticed. The grain of his cheeks faded. His elbows no longer clicked, but popped. His knees began to swell with rounded knobs beneath the wood. When Geppetto stitched a tear in Pinocchio's shirt, he saw beneath the collar that the upper chest had gone from hard, polished surface to something like bark laid over moving tissue. Veins, faint and blue, wandered under the pale brown. Geppetto told himself miracles are seldom neat. Jiminy was less certain. One rainy afternoon, Pinocchio came home from the village school with his cap missing and his eyes hot with humiliation. The other boys had laughed when he failed to sit properly because his hips had stiffened. They laughed when he could not write well with fingers that cramped. One boy called him puppet, another called him dead tree, and the cruelest boy, a butcher's son, asked how long before worms found a home in him. Pinocchio struck him and was beaten in return. "Did you fight?" Geppetto asked when he saw the torn shirt and bruised cheek. "No," Pinocchio said. His nose shot forward so violently that the skin on his face split beside it. He screamed. This time the growth was no clean extension of polished wood. It came with a sound like green branches twisting under strain. The bridge of his nose lengthened, but so did the bones beneath his eyes. His forehead bulged, his upper jaw shoved outward. The mouth stretched too wide and tore at both corners, spilling blood down his chin. Under the splitting lacquer of his face, raw pink tissue pushed through in slick ropes. The tip of his nose darkened and cracked. Tiny branching veins burst across it. Geppetto stumbled back in horror. Jiminy shouted from somewhere near the clock, but Pinocchio heard only the shrieking inside his own head. He grabbed the nose with both hands and tried to push it back. A strip of painted wood came away, still attached to something stringy and red. He dropped it and stared as it twitched on the floor like a cut worm. Geppetto rushed to him with towels and shaking hands. He wiped the blood. He whispered that it would be all right, though his own face had gone gray. He dared not look too closely at the wounds. Inside the split skin were not gears, not hollow channels, not sawdust. There was muscle. There were tiny white cords flexing beneath it. There was the wet gleam of living cartilage forcing itself into a shape first imagined by a lie. That night Pinocchio could not sleep. Every part of him ached. His growing body felt wrong in every joint. He lay on his narrow bed under a patched blanket and listened to the sounds inside himself. Soft slips, creaks, the tug of fibers lengthening. Something deep in his chest made a faint pumping noise. He pressed his hands to his ribs. Something moved underneath, pushing outward from within. He bit his lip and felt warm blood. Across the room, Jiminy spoke into the dark. "You must tell the truth." Pinocchio turned his head slowly. Moonlight laid pale bars across the floorboards, and the cricket's tiny shape perched on the window latch. "I did tell the truth," Pinocchio whispered. Jiminy was silent for a moment. "Then you are lying now." Pinocchio's throat tightened. "I hate you." "I know," said Jiminy, "but I am not the one doing this." Pinocchio rose from his bed and crossed the room. Each step now carried an ugly softness that had not been there before. His feet were still wooden on the outside, but beneath them something compressed and shifted. He felt the grain in his soles bending over tender new pads. It made him furious. He grabbed Jiminy. The cricket kicked and writhed in Pinocchio's fist. "Let go," Jiminy cried. "Stop telling me what to do. Let go, boy. I am not a boy." At that, Pinocchio closed his hand. There was a tiny crunch. A smear of green and brown leaked between his fingers. He opened them and stared at what remained. One wing trembled once, then stilled. The room became terribly quiet. Pinocchio wiped his hand on the blanket and began to shake. In the morning, Geppetto found the crushed cricket beneath the bed. He buried it beside the cottage under the yellow flowers, saying a prayer in a voice so thin it nearly vanished in the wind. Pinocchio stood behind him, silent and miserable, with his cap low over his face. Geppetto did not ask what had happened. The old man understood enough to fear the answer. The blue fairy returned that evening. No door opened for her. No latch lifted. She simply appeared near the cold hearth in a shimmer of blue light. Geppetto rose so fast his chair fell backward. Pinocchio, who had been staring into the ashes, recoiled into the corner like a whipped animal. "You gave me life," he said. "Make it stop hurting." The fairy regarded him with calm interest. Her eyes eyes were too bright, too clear. Not human eyes. The eyes of something that has never bled. You wished to be real, she said. I did not know this was real. A soft smile touched her mouth. Few do. Geppetto fell to his knees before her. Please, he has suffered enough. If some wrong has been done, undo it. Take back the wish. Let him be wood again, if that is kinder. She looked down at the old man, with pity so delicate it was almost cruelty. No wish is taken back. It only ripens. Pinocchio stepped forward. In the lamplight, his changes were clearer than ever. The painted blush had worn away from his cheeks, where the skin now showed through in waxy patches. His neck bore lines like healed cuts. His hands had thickened at the joints, and the fingernails were no longer painted suggestions, but pale keratin crescents growing through split wood. He trembled with effort and with hatred. You said I could become real if I was brave and truthful and unselfish. Yes, then why does every lie tear me apart? Because lies do not merely lengthen your nose, little one. They reveal what resists the making. Wood is simple. Flesh remembers every violence required to shape it. Geppetto sobbed openly now. He is a child. The fairy's gaze shifted to Pinocchio. No, he is a thing between states. That is why he suffers so beautifully. The room chilled. Frost fanned slowly across the inside of the window. You will finish becoming what was asked of you, she said. Or you will break under the effort. That is not my sorrow to carry. Then she was gone. In the days that followed, fear entered the cottage as a permanent resident. Geppetto tried to keep Pinocchio close, tried to shield him from temptation, cruelty, and shame. But children are made partly from defiance, and Pinocchio, more than most, he hated the pity in Geppetto's eyes. He hated the mirror above the wash basin, which no longer showed a puppet, but some unfinished creature wearing a child's outline. He hated the ache in his bones, though he had never had bones before, and did not understand the betrayal of their existence. One evening, while Geppetto repaired a chair leg in the workshop, Pinocchio slipped out and followed the sound of music drifting from the market road. That was where he met Honest John and Gideon. Honest John was a fox of a man with a velvet coat slick from rain, and too many compliments ready on his tongue. His narrow face always seemed one smile away from mockery. Beside him lumbered Gideon, huge and mute, with hands like mallets and small wet eyes. They operated a traveling puppet theater beneath a striped tent near the square. Lanterns glowed warm against the dark. Painted signs promised marvels, laughter, songs, and dancing wonders. Honest John took one look at Pinocchio, and his clever gaze sharpened. My dear boy, he said, bowing low, you belong on a stage. Pinocchio should have fled, but the music was sweet, and the crowd beyond the tent rope sounded happy. More than that, Honest John looked at him without pity, without horror. He saw in Pinocchio not a mistake, but a curiosity that might be useful. Inside the theater, marionettes hung from wires with painted smiles. Their fixed faces turned in the lantern glow. The smell of dust, grease paint, and damp canvas wrapped around Pinocchio. Like a spell, a wooden puppet among wooden puppets. For the first time since the change began, he felt almost safe. Stromboli, master of the theater, was a massive man with a beard black as chimney soot and eyes buried deep in folds of flesh. When he saw Pinocchio move and speak, his mouth opened in greedy amazement. He clapped his hands and laughed until his shoulders shook. A wonder, he roared, a living puppet, a fortune. Pinocchio danced that night under the hot lanterns while a crowd shouted and stamped. At first, the joy was real. He was nimble. His body, though changing, still possessed the lightness of wood in some places. He flipped and bowed. He sang. The audience adored him. Coins rained onto the stage. Stromboli's grin grew wider with every chime. Then a little girl in the front row called, "Are you a real boy?" Pinocchio froze. All those faces turned up to him, eager and bright. "Yes," he said. The first pop came from his left shoulder. His shirt bulged. He gasped and clutched at it. But the second lie was already rising in panic. "Yes," he repeated more loudly. "I am real." The audience laughed, thinking it part of the act. His right hand clenched into a claw. Wood split along the knuckles. White bone tips, wet and glistening, pushed through like teeth through gum. The arm lengthened by a finger's width, then another. The shoulder tore open under the cloth with a sound like soaked fabric ripping. Strands of red muscle stretched from the split shell of the upper arm and snapped one by one, spraying warmth across his chest. The lantern light shone on blood. The laughter faltered. Pinocchio stumbled backward, choking as his spine arched. Under his collar, vertebrae knocked into being, each one forcing itself through channels where none had existed. His neck grew longer. His jaw clicked and slid sideways. One eye bulged as the socket deepened around it. His nose pushed forward, grotesquely long. But this time it was part timber, part cartilage, striped in grain and veined flesh. Women screamed. Men lurched to their feet. A child began sobbing. Stromboli dragged the curtain closed while Pinocchio collapsed behind it in a heap of twitching limbs. When the fit ended, he lay in a spreading pool of blood and cloudy yellow fluid, panting like a dog. Stromboli knelt beside him, breathing hard through flared nostrils. He did not look afraid. He looked delighted. "Even better," he whispered. Pinocchio tried to crawl away. Stromboli seized him by the ankle and hauled him across the boards. "You will make me rich forever." He locked Pinocchio in a wagon cage behind the theater among spare puppets and rolled scenery. The iron bars smelled of rust and old rain. The other puppets, hanging from hooks in the gloom, swayed gently whenever the wind struck the canvas. Their painted eyes seemed to follow him. Pinocchio curled in straw and tried not to move. He was weaker than before. The more his body changed, the less he understood where pain ended and self began. His chest now rose and fell on its own, steadily, horribly. He could feel a heart. It beat beneath the left side of his ribcage like a fist in a wall. When he pressed there, it thudded back. Near midnight, the wagon door creaked open. Geppetto stood there with a lantern and a knife for the bars. Rain silvered his white hair and beard. Relief and grief fought openly on his face when he saw Pinocchio. Alive. "Come, my boy," he whispered. Pinocchio staggered into his arms. For a moment, he let himself be held. The old man smelled of wool, pine shavings, and smoke. Home. Then Geppetto felt the wetness beneath the shirt. He pulled back and lifted the lantern. Pinocchio's body was no longer mostly wood. The chest had softened into pale, stretched skin, interrupted by strips of bark like scabs. The collarbones jutted sharp. The belly moved with shallow breath. Around the shoulders and ribs, seams of split timber stood open on either side of slick red tissue, as if a statue had been cracked to reveal a butchered child packed inside. His left arm from elbow to wrist remained almost entirely carved wood, but the hand had become flesh tipped with nails. One leg was smooth, polished pine to the knee, and below that hung a living calf threaded with blue veins and sparse dark hair. Geppetto's face collapsed. Pinocchio looked away. "Do not look at me." But fathers look, even when it destroys them. Geppetto wrapped him in a cloak and led him into the storm. They did not reach home. On the road through the pines, fog thickened between the trunks. Lantern light weakened. The trees leaned inward. Somewhere ahead, laughter rang out, shrill and childish. Then came voices calling from deeper in the woods. Pleasure Island. Every child in the village knew the stories. A place beyond rules where boys could smoke, drink, break windows, fight, and feast without punishment. A place no adult could enter. The wicked little fantasy of every scolded child. In the fog, it found its own way to them. Lights bloomed between the trees, warm and golden. Music drifted over the moss. Pinocchio smelled sugar, roast meat, cider, sawdust, and something rank beneath it all, hidden under sweetness like rot beneath perfume. Boys ran laughing through the lantern glow with blackened teeth and bruised faces. They threw stones at bottles, gambled with cards, and chased each other with knives too dull to kill quickly. Their joy was feverish and ugly. Some already had ears too long beneath their caps. Some had dark, coarse hair crawling along their hands. Geppetto saw it at once and tried to pull Pinocchio away. But Pinocchio stared at the boys with hollow longing. No pity there. No rules. No schoolroom mockery. Only chaos. Freedom. Noise loud enough to drown the sounds inside his own body. "I want to go," he whispered. "No, please. No, Pinocchio." The old man's grip tightened. Pinocchio met his eyes. "I hate being with you." The lie ignited through him like fire in dry leaves. He screamed and dropped to his knees in the mud. This was the worst yet. Back split down the center, shirt bursting apart. Beneath the opening, vertebrae pushed outward in a glistening white ridge before sinking under skin too thin to cover them. His ears stretched, sharpened, and climbed higher on his head. Teeth punched through his gums with wet clicking sounds, broad and flat at the back, heavy grinding teeth. His legs bowed as the joints reformed. One wooden foot cracked open like kindling around the growth of a hoofdark and shining with blood. His stomach cramped and rippled. Gas and bile forced up his throat. He vomited black splinters, clots of blood, and half-digested pear onto the road. Geppetto cried out and gathered him close despite the blood, despite the stink. Pleasure Island boys circled them laughing until they saw too much and stepped back pale-faced. Even wicked children recognize true suffering. Pinocchio convulsed in the mud until the fit passed. When he could see again, Geppetto's coat was soaked through with blood. "I am sorry, Pinocchio," whispered. The old man kissed his hair, though strands of coarse gray fur had begun to thread through it. "We go home now. No more wandering, no more lies." But home was farther away than ever. By the time they reached the cottage near dawn, Pinocchio could barely stand. Geppetto laid him on the workbench because the bed was too soft for the new unnatural angles of his body. Rain drummed on the roof. The lamp burned low. Geppetto washed him with hot water and cloths until the basin ran pink, then red, then nearly black. He cut away broken wood where it hung loose. He bound the worst splits with linen. In places where flesh met timber, there was no clean border. Tendons threaded directly into grain. Blood seeped through knots in the wood, as though roots had tapped an artery. "I do not know how to mend you," Geppetto confessed. Pinocchio stared at the ceiling, eyes rimmed dark from pain. "Then let me die." Geppetto froze. No father survives hearing that without part of himself dying first. "You are my son," he whispered. "I am your mistake." Geppetto bent over the bench as though struck in the back. He pressed his forehead to Pinocchio's hand, the one still half wooden, half living. His shoulders shook in silence. Days passed in dim misery. The village doctor came once, took one look at Pinocchio, crossed himself, and left without touching him. Word spread. Children were forbidden to go near the cottage. Men made signs against evil when they passed. Women left loaves or broth on the doorstep out of pity and never waited to be thanked. Inside, the transformation advanced. Pinocchio's remaining wooden skin grew brittle in patches and slewed away, revealing damp pale flesh underneath like the underside of mushrooms. In other places, fresh bark formed over living tissue, hardening into plates that cracked whenever he moved. His hair darkened and thickened. His eyes, once round and painted, now blinked, but never fully closed. At night, they shone faintly in the firelight. His voice deepened, then cracked, then became rough again. Sometimes he woke with his mouth full of wood splinters he had coughed up from his own lungs. The worst was the lying, because terror makes liars of us all. Does it hurt? Geppetto would ask. No. The ribs would shift. Are you thirsty? No. The throat would swell, until swallowing became difficult. Do you hate me? Pinocchio would hesitate too long, and the body would answer before the tongue could. One evening, Geppetto returned from the church, carrying a small silver crucifix and a face hollowed out by desperation. He had begged the priest for help and received only warnings. Evil had entered the house, the priest said. If the puppet was not destroyed, worse would follow. Geppetto sat by the bench and turned the crucifix in his fingers. I will not burn you, he said. Pinocchio watched him with those sleepless, gleaming eyes. Would it work? Geppetto did not answer. That night, while wind dragged branches over the roof like fingernails, a shadow moved outside the shutters. The latch lifted on its own. Blue light spilled into the room. The blue fairy had returned. Pinocchio tried to rise, but pain nailed him down. Geppetto stood between them. You will not touch him again. The fairy's expression remained serene. I need not. The work continues. She approached the bench. Pinocchio could smell rain and lilies again. And beneath that, the cold mineral scent of deep water where no sun reaches. You are nearly complete, she said. Pinocchio stared up at her, face half child, half malformed thing. This is not complete. It is the truest form of becoming you are capable of. Geppetto's voice broke. Please. She looked at him. You asked for life. Did you imagine life would come unstained by suffering? Flesh is a debt. Every breath is a payment. Pinocchio's heart hammered wildly. Then why do boys become boys and not this? Because boys are born through pain already paid by others. You were made in innocence and wished into burden. The body resents shortcuts. Geppetto seized the crucifix and held it out as if faith could become a weapon. Leave us. The fairy tilted her head, almost curious. Do you still believe you are the wronged one, old man? You carved a shape and begged heaven to fill it. You did not ask what would be displaced to make room. At that, something shifted in the darkness near the hearth. A voice, small and familiar, rose from nowhere and everywhere at once. Father. Geppetto turned white. Pinocchio heard it too. The room seemed to bend around the sound. A child's voice, human, trembling, not his. Again it came, Father. Geppetto dropped the crucifix. It struck the floor and spun. His mouth opened, but no sound emerged. The fairy watched him with patient cruelty. From the crack between the floorboards beside the hearth, a tiny pale finger emerged. Then another. Wet, slick, human. Geppetto backed into the wall. No, he whispered. The floorboards bulged upward. Nails screeched free. Something pushed from beneath the cottage, forcing its way into the room with slow, determined pressure. First a hand, then a forehead, then one half of a child's face coated in dirt and black roots. It was a little boy, perhaps 6 or 7 years old, but not whole. One eye was gone. The scalp hung open in places. Worms moved lazily through the hair. Yet, the remaining eye stared straight at Geppetto with devastated recognition. "Father," it said. Geppetto made a sound no human throat should make. Pinocchio tried to scramble away, but his legs failed him. The thing in the floor continued hauling itself upward. More earth spilled out, bits of coffin wood, a rotten sleeve, a smell so foul the lamp flame fluttered. Geppetto sank to his knees. Matteo. The name trembled in the room like a snapped string. The fairy spoke softly. A wish must be answered from somewhere. Pinocchio understood then, though he wanted not to. He looked at Geppetto, at the horror in the old man's face, and knew that once there had indeed been a son. A dead one, buried, mourned, unfinished in the heart. When Geppetto asked for a child, something had listened. Something had reached into the dark beneath memory and grief and taken from it what remained. Not a soul, perhaps, not fully, but enough. The little dead boy pulled himself onto the floorboards and collapsed there, boneless and leaking grave water. He extended one filthy hand toward Geppetto. Pinocchio began to sob. "I did not know," Geppetto said, "whether to the corpse, the fairy, or the boy on the bench. No one could tell." The fairy turned to Pinocchio. "Now you understand. Truth completes the work." Pinocchio felt something inside him loosen and plunge downward as if a knot had been cut. His chest spasmed. His spine arched so hard the workbench groaned. Every remaining plate of wood on his body cracked at once. The final change had begun. He screamed until the room rang with it. His sternum split down the middle. Skin and bark parted like forced doors. Ribs unfurled beneath, white and slick, each one forming in a shudder of agony. The heart between them beat huge and furious, wrapped in veined membrane. His left cheek shed its last painted shell, exposing living flesh underneath so new it shone. One eye wept blood. His jaw shortened, then widened, grinding his teeth together until several shattered and regrew broader. The wooden leg softened from the knee upward, collapsing inward as muscle layered itself around newborn bone. But the foot remained hoofed. The wooden arm convulsed, splintered, and opened like a husk around a living forearm struggling out from within. Tendons snapped into place beneath translucent skin. Fingers elongated. Nails darkened. He was becoming real, but not human. His face took on the proportions of a boy, only in glimpses. Each time it seemed to settle, a lie hidden in fear, in resentment, in self-hatred shifted something again. The nose shrank, but stayed a little too long. The ears remained pointed. The teeth remained wrong. His skin bore faint, would grain under its pallor like old scars. Hair covered his forearms in coarse dark patches. A tailbone pushed too sharply at the base of his spine. His eyes, one brown and one blue-white, reflected light like an animal. Geppetto crawled to him, tears and snot on his face, hands shaking uncontrollably. Pinocchio, 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 could hardly speak through the blood in his mouth. Father, he rasped. It was the first full truth that came without pain. For a single heartbeat, the room became still. Then the dead child by the hearth began to laugh. Not a child's laugh. A wet, bubbling thing that rose from a chest full of dirt. Its remaining eye rolled toward Pinocchio. Its jaw unhinged. Black roots spilled from its mouth, slithering across the floorboards toward the bench. The cottage groaned around them. From beneath the house came more scratching, more tiny voices. Thin hands poked up between the boards, all across the room. The fairy stepped back into her blue light, untouched by panic. All debts ripen, she said. Geppetto lunged for his knife. He hacked at the roots as they coiled around the bench legs. Thick black sap sprayed across the floor. The dead child crawled forward with jerking limbs. Pinocchio, still half writhing in the remains of his metamorphosis, slid from the bench and hit the floor hard enough to knock the breath from his new lungs. Pain blinded him. He saw Geppetto drive the knife into the dead child's throat. The blade stuck there. No blood came out, only a burst of pale moths and grave dirt. Hands seized Geppetto's ankles from beneath the boards. He cried out and went down. Pinocchio dragged himself forward. Every movement tore something not yet healed. He grabbed Geppetto's wrists. The old man clung to him with desperate strength as more dead hands closed around his legs, pulling him toward the widening black gap in the floor. Do not let go, Geppetto gasped. Pinocchio tried. He truly tried. But truth had come too late to save what had already been summoned. The floor split open beneath them with a crack like thunder. Cold earth yawned below, crawling with roots, coffin planks, pale faces, and the slow shifting shapes of children who had once been wanted too much or mourned too long. The smell of wet soil and sweet rot surged upward. Geppetto slipped. Pinocchio caught him by one hand. For an instant, their eyes met. The old man looked not afraid now, but broken by understanding. He had asked for a son and made a grave into a cradle. All his love could not undo that. I am sorry, he whispered. Then the dead hands dragged him down. Pinocchio screamed and reached after him, but the fingers slid from his grasp slick with mud. Geppetto vanished into the earth with the others. The floor slammed shut over him in a shower of splinters. Silence followed, complete, immense. The blue fairy was gone. The cottage stood ruined around Pinocchio. The lamp had fallen and gone dark. Moonlight entered through the split shutters and silvered the wreckage. The dead child had vanished. Only dirt and roots remained where it had been. Beneath the floorboards came one last muffled knock. Then nothing. Pinocchio lay there until dawn. When morning came, villagers found the cottage door open and the old woodcarver nowhere inside. The workshop was in shambles. The floor was warped and blackened in places. On the bench and walls were smears of blood and stranger stains they could not name. Of the puppet, there was no trace, so the village made its own story. Some said Geppetto had gone mad and wandered into the pines to die. Some said the devil had taken him. Others whispered that the puppet had killed him and fled. The priest blessed the house from a distance and told the villagers to leave it empty. They obeyed. Years passed. The cottage sagged further. Moss swallowed the doorstep. The yellow flowers by Jiminy's little grave grew wild and tall. Children dared each other to touch the shutters and run. Sometimes they swore they heard movement inside. A scraping, a cough. Once, on a winter night, a butcher's son passing drunk on the road claimed he saw a figure watching from the upper window. Not wood, not entirely flesh. A long-faced boy with one bright eye and one dull one, standing very still while snow gathered on the sill around him. He never passed that road again. As for Pinocchio, he did not die in the cottage. He could not. The body completed by cursed truth was stronger than sickness, yet never free of pain. He learned to walk on feet that were not made for human roads. He learned to hide his face beneath scarves and caps. He learned that hunger was real and terrible, and that food filled a stomach, but never the hollow under grief. He learned that people fear what does not fit the world they know, and fear turns quickly to hatred. Most of all, he learned that becoming real is not the same as becoming loved. Wandered from village to village, from carnival to farm, from roadside ditch to abandoned chapel. In some places he was taken for a sickly boy and given crusts of bread. In others they saw too much and drove him off with stones. Lies still warped him, though now the changes were smaller, cumulative, permanent. A false name thickened his tongue. A denied hunger sharpened his teeth. A claimed innocence bent one finger backward until it remained that way forever. Year after year, the body kept a ledger. He stopped lying as often as he could. It did not make him better. It only made him aware. Sometimes he would wake before dawn, with Geppetto's final whisper in his ears, and blood under his nails from dreams of clawing at dirt. Sometimes he would think he heard Jiminy in the rustle of dry leaves, telling him the truth too late again. Sometimes in ponds or dark windows, he would catch the shape of his own reflection and see the puppet still buried under the flesh, looking out through it, trapped forever at the center. Decades later, when the old village had grown and roads had widened, and no one remembered Geppetto except as a cautionary tale, children began disappearing from neighboring towns. Never many at once. One in spring, another in late autumn. A boy known for lying to his mother, a cruel child who broke birds for fun, a lonely one who wished aloud to be loved. Their shoes would be found near the edge of forests or beside abandoned roads. Nothing else. Travelers told stories of a man, or something like a man, who visited children after dark. He was polite, soft-spoken. His face was hidden. He asked them questions about truth and longing. and whether they had ever wished to be something else. Those who answered dishonestly were said to hear a terrible creaking in the trees long after he had gone. And sometimes, in lonely houses where grief sat too heavily on the chest of a parent, a pale block of warm wood would be found near the hearth or behind the shed, as if left there by accident. It was always smooth. It always seemed to pulse faintly under the hand. And if it was carved, if it was loved too quickly, if a wish was spoken over it in the dark, then on certain nights, a blue light might pass through the shutters and pause beside the waiting shape. Tonight, if you listen to old stories, you may still hear that Pinocchio became a real boy in the end. That is true in the strictest and cruelest sense. He gained a beating heart. He gained lungs that could drown. He gained skin that could tear and nerves that could burn and a stomach that could starve. He gained the ability to mourn, to remember, and to understand exactly what had been taken to make him. He gained all the terrible gifts of life, but he never became human, and he never again called anyone father. So if you ever find yourself envying the old fairy tales, wishing miracles were real, wishing love alone could pull something beautiful out of loneliness, remember Geppetto's cottage at the edge of the pines. Remember the puppet on the bench, with flesh trying to bloom through splintered wood. Remember that some prayers are answered by things that do not love us. Remember that truth can save the soul and still leave the body ruined. That is the end of tonight's story. If you stayed with me all the way through, thank you for listening. Please subscribe and like the video for more. Good night.
Whispers of a love so true, painting dreams of me and you. And I'll hold you close in this moment.